This episode of The Four Top is coming to you courtesy of Live. That's Live, an insider tip that stands for Low Input Viticulture and Enology. Live is the leading third-party certifier of sustainable wine growing in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. You can see Live certification on wines from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. I have personally worked with Live and its members for years, and I just have to say I'm so proud to have them as a supporter. So stay tuned, folks, for our sponsor break later in the show. You can hear more about Live and its members' commitment to climate action, worker rights, natural resource conservation, and so much more. Thank you so much, Live. And now it's time for the Four Top.
You know why cows have hooves instead of feet?
I have no idea. Why?
Because they lactose. You know, I've got some friends who are farmers. Every time I tell any jokes to them, they laugh, but their sheepdogs never laugh. And I was trying to figure out why. And so my farmer friend is like, that's because the sheepdogs have heard them all.
Hello and welcome to The Four Top. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine world. I am your host, Catherine Cole.
And I'm your host, Martin Reyes, Master of Wine, and I'm excited to talk about biodiversity today as we continue our sustainability season here at The Four Top.
Yeah, you know a lot about biodiversity, Martin. I think you can maybe introduce us to all the different styles that our listeners are probably somewhat familiar with.
I should be clear, I'm not a farmer, but I play one on TV is the I wanted not to say that. No, I'm not a farmer. I don't have any practical knowledge, but obviously I speak to the sommelier community, to the wine directors, and to our staff, and of course to the consumer. That's my lens. For the purposes of this episode, I want to tell you the basics, of course, right? So when people say organic viticulture, all that means is the farming practice that prohibits the use of synthetic inputs, so fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. When you see that on the name of the bottle, made with organically grown grapes, that usually is referencing that form of organic viticulture. I know it's very simplistic, but for today, that's kind of what that means. And when somebody says biodynamic farming, it builds on top of the organic and delivers a prescriptive farming practice. It's a series of compost preparations, ethical animal treatment, astrological cycle influences, and a holistic way of viewing the farm as an ecosystem and part of a broader earth and so forth and universe. And then you'll hear terms like regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming. There's some shared elements of organic and biodynamic. Those, of course, are certifications that have these specific practices. The focus there is being a solution in the climate action fight. So increasing the resilience of the vineyard against drought and heat spikes while also storing more carbon in the soil through things like focusing on soil health, organic matter, increased water and nutrient retention, and of course, biodiversity. So there's all kinds of practices, reduced tillage, compost, cover crops. It's a long definition, but that one's worth remembering because that really is where we're moving towards in the sustainability fight.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's sustainability certifications, which kind of vary from region to region, and conventional farming, which is kind of a free-for-all, right?
Right. Conventional, exactly.
Yeah, I think today we are going to take this biodiversity and agriculture conversation in a really interesting direction with our guests. And on that note, I would like to start introducing them with former Master Sommelier Nate Reddy, who made his name in the restaurant world at the French Laundry in Napa and Frasca in Boulder before moving to the winery side. And I will say most notably, because I'm here in Oregon, at the legendary Antica Terra in the Willamette Valley. Nate is now the winemaker, cider maker, and co-owner at Hiyu Wine Farm in Oregon's beautiful Columbia River Gorge. And I'm so excited about this episode because I wrote an article a few years ago about Nate's really unique approach to viticulture. And actually, toward the end of the article, I said the only other grower in the United States who's doing something similar to Hiyu is our next guest.
California iconoclast and icon Randall Grahm. As I'm sure our guests know, Randall founded Bonny Doon Vineyard in the Santa Cruz Mountains, as well as the popular Big House wine brand. He's a celebrated author and recipient of multiple honors, including 2 James Beard Awards and induction into the Culinary Institute of America's Vintners Hall of Fame. He's currently focused on 2 projects, which will be fun to talk about today: a wine label called The Language of Yes, and a vineyard in San Juan Bautista, California, called Poplochom. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right.
Más o menos.
Más o menos? Okay. I guess I said San Juan Bautista. Okay, that part was okay. Welcome, Randall.
Thank you so much.
We'll work on our pronunciation as we get through this episode. Randall, I wanted to start with you. Martin defined some of the best known forms of viticulture, and I have a feeling you've probably tried them all during your career. But both you and Nate are delving into some other farming methods that our listeners may have never heard of. And it would be fun to just give them a little more agricultural vocab and tell us about some of the kind of more interesting and maybe peripheral forms of farming that we should all know about.
Well, I don't actually have a name for the kind of farming I do. I mean, aspirational farming, I think, is probably the best. I'm trying to achieve something on the order of robustness and resilience. So any strategy that enhances the resilience of the plants to stresses, challenges, is all to the good. I'm also interested in extreme diversity, as is Nate, taking a slightly different course, mostly through genetic variability. So I'm trying to introduce plantings that have a extremely large genetically diverse makeup in the idea that this could create possibilities for variation, favorable agronomic outcomes, and just enhance complexity. So as we often say in my ventures, what could possibly go wrong?
I've heard you say that before. Well, okay, so as a base definition, would you say you're practicing permaculture?
The best solution to permaculture is planting your vineyard in the right location. So in other words, finding a location that naturally provides sustenance to the vines. In other words, the right amount of sunshine, the right amount of rainfall, more or less most of the time. This is achievable in one's mind, but not always in reality. So the solutions are never perfect. In our case, in San Juan Bautista, we don't get quite enough rain to dry farm. In a perfect world, we would dry farm without supplemental irrigation. We don't, unfortunately, live in a perfect world. So therefore, if you have to do inputs, the question is, what are the most thoughtful inputs you can do? So let me give you an example, if I may. Irrigation. Typically, plants are irrigated in California with drip irrigation. The problem with drip irrigation is that you're essentially creating a flower pot effect. You irrigate all the time in the same place in a very localized area, and the plant isn't stupid. The plant grows roots where the water is deposited, and so therefore it has a very limited root system. And a limited root system does not enhance the resilience and the robustness of the vine. A robust root system, ubiquitous root system, is really what you want. So you're going to irrigate, you want to create the opportunity for the plant to roam far and wide looking for water.
And just to back up, permaculture, the definition is that it's a self-sustaining form of agriculture where you really don't have to do much in terms of inputs to keep it running. Well, Nate, I want to quickly turn to you. I know what you're doing is also incredibly complex, but I think I remember you saying that you're a fan of the author Masanobu Fukuoka. I know it's impossible to sum it up in just a few words, but could you tell us the style of farming you're practicing?
Yeah, I mean, we had so many points of inspiration. All these different things are in play, like biodynamics and permaculture. Fukuoka is particularly interesting. I think he was sort of like, people described his way of farming as sort of natural farming, but I think he described it himself as do-nothing farming.
That's right.
Or kind of aspiring to do-nothing farming.
Mm-hmm.
It is sort of like pre-permaculture, like sort of predates like that idea. And I think for him, the idea is to put a system in place so that life flows from it, in as fluid and kind of natural, like a way, like as possible. When he was trying to grow rice, without the paddies, without tilling, that system of farming involved people, ducks, buckwheat, and rice, so that you could have sort of a self-perpetuating rice paddy where you didn't have to till, but also you really didn't have to reseed, and you didn't have to bring in any other fertility kind of from outside that system in. And he would do similar things like, he was also a citrus grower, so he kind of had these commercial systems like rice, citrus, but then rather than sort of having this monoculture, those two things, you try to layer inside those systems so that there was these other cultural yields in terms of like beauty. So like in the citrus orchard, they would grow vegetables to like eat beneath it, so you'd have, the things that would normally be in the garden would be growing wild underneath this commercial citrus orchard. And so that citrus orchard itself could be like the financial basis for the farm, but then all the people that would come to work there could collect their food from beneath the trees. And that was like beautiful in and of itself, but also kind of created like health for the humans living there, but also for the trees itself. So for us, that was like this huge like inspiration, just like looking for all these opportunities where you could kind of layer different kinds of lives and then have all these yields. And this is the big permaculture thing, is that you don't conceive of yield as being a single thing in a space and kind of just one moment, but you can kind of conceive of spaces as being more dimensional, both in terms of time, genetics, life forms, beauty, like kind of et cetera, and that you don't see it as just a crop at a tonnage, but on all these different levels. So even like intensity of a crop, right, would be a potential part of yield, which is something that we don't see. Like, if like, say in the Hood River Valley here where I am, there's a lot of commercial pear growers. Like quality is not something that they're looking at. They're not looking at intensity of flavor as like being part of the yield. They're also not looking at like what the experience is of like living and walking and existing in that orchard as being part of the yield, or what that kind of orchard could do for like people that work there, or plants or insects or bacteria that inhabit the space. So I think this is like sort of key to like all this on like the natural farming permaculture side is kind of seeing these more complex relationships and taking all that into account as we're acting in these kind of physical spaces, which really are these kind of matrices of life on like so many different levels.
I think you just answered a question I was about to ask you, which is what is a food forest? But I just pictured it. It just sounds so beautiful and amazing.
Yeah, totally. And the big thing for like food forests, right, is it's like so many different things like living together. And it's this sort of, it's the 3D growing, right, where you, again, if you think of like the vines, right, in a typical vineyard or like in an orchard, there's all this space kind of up in the air and underneath the plants that like isn't being used. It's this whole thing about competition that we've gotten so wrong. And so much of like how we farm is based on the idea that plants are antagonistic with each other. So that when we have a vineyard or we have an orchard or we have a garden, we till and we mow to remove all the competition from the plant that is supposed to be the main. But this is not a scientifically proven thing that plants act in that way. And mostly like what we see is that like plants are symbiotic. And so that they grow together. And if you watch any kind of natural or wild kind of situation, you'll see plants entangled and for each other's benefit, and also for the benefit of like for kind of all these other living creatures. So this is also like a huge part of
it. I read recently about the promises of seeds, in the sense that basically the intention of plants, the intention of nature is to have a symbiotic balance, right? And what we've done is what you can call antagonistic, or there's sort of a one-directional purpose, right? Where things like the seed of any fruit, in this case grapes, we've treated them as byproducts, and then therefore just sort of waste afterward, and they're done. And yet the intention of the plant as a seed is they're little babies, right? The plant wants to procreate, and eating an apple and throwing the seeds away really is breaking that cycle. So Randall, I'd love for you to tell us about your intention about growing from seed with that in mind.
Well, what's interesting about seed is that it's a chance to kind of reshuffle the genetic code and kind of all the memories of the organism that have been repressed or suppressed or occluded kind of reemerge. So it's like getting another chance, if you will. We're basically taking two strategies with our breeding program. One is to do self-crossing, which was generally thought of by everyone I spoke to initially as an extremely bad idea because of the occurrence of recessive genes or the expression of recessive genes. In other words, genetic flaws. However, there's some really interesting things that happen on the recessive genes. What we're finding is incredible variability, a lot of funny looking plants, but a lot of really interesting looking plants that would never see the light of day otherwise. And then the other thing we're doing is sort of more classical crosses, where we're taking disparate lineages and crossing them, and then you're getting obviously much healthier, more viable plants, strange and new ones. And the thought, it's kind of, for me, it's a bit of a Gestalt issue with the use of genetic diversity. And it's maybe a leap of logic or faith or some leap of something, which is to say, by essentially effacing varietal characteristics, in other words, obscuring the varietal characteristics, it's a strategy for allowing other qualities of the site to emerge. In other words, soil characteristics. My feeling is if you produce a wine that expresses not just varietal characteristics, but has qualities of the imprint of the place from which it's grown, you're going to produce a much more complex wine. So this is a strategy to pursue that end, if you will.
All right, thank you. Nate, I also heard you use hand scythes. Is that how you pronounce it? Scythe, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, how much of your farming is just complete, like seriously hands-on, and why do you do that?
So most of our control of vegetation is with animals primarily. So with pigs and cows and ducks and geese and chickens. And for us, pigs are actually we work with a breed of heritage pig, American guinea hogs crossed with kune-kunes that predominantly graze and they root in a very gentle way. We use the scythes in places where maybe the animals aren't being quite as efficient as they need to be to help us out a little bit with the farming. And so we typically do a single pass with a scythe beneath the vines, in the sort of like the middle of the spring, kind of when the growth beneath the canopy is its strongest. And I think a lot of it for us is just trying to be not too dogmatic about things and open to stuff. And so people they talk about no mow, no till. And it's funny for us, it's we do both those things. We do till, but we till with animals, and we do mow, but we use an Austrian sort of scythe.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And a lot of it for us is the ways that we're kind of connect to more primal historical ways of living or kind of interacting with plants, not for a dream or a wish, not for anachronistic reasons, not because we want to kind of completely go back to that time, but just because by sort of imagining sort of what vine growing might have been in the Middle Ages, or what making wine would have been in that period, I think it opens up kind of creative possibilities that we don't see when we're just stuck in our current way of sort of viewing things. And so, for instance, the field blends, for us, really emerge, from that, but a lot of our other sort of practices as well is trying to understand, what does it mean to take the tractor, away from the vineyard? What are, the ramifications when we kind of do that? And what kind of creative possibilities and flavor possibilities kind of open up.
How do you make sense of it, and how do you create order, or do you create order, or do you throw the I Ching and basically use the universe as a guide to what your blends might be? Or how do you begin to even think about rationalizing your blends, or do you?
I mean, it's an amazing question. It's something we think about all the time. I mean, I think as humans, there is I think an irrational need to be rational, because there's no sort of need to be rational with this is what we've discovered. I think in the beginning, I just needed some sort of tether. And I think this was kind of like sort of human weakness or like whatnot. And I used kind of historical genetic sets as like the basis for assembling them. But then I would always intentionally throw things in then at the end that didn't make sense, just because I also felt like there was a need for the irrational to be there kind of with the rational. And that's been like our sort of protocol. And what's interesting is like at the end of the day, like what emerges is not taught, like it's nothing you could predict. Like the flavors are completely different than if you'd sort of assembled individual wines from those varietals like sort of later, so some sort of alchemy is happening both in the field and also in the fermenter, when those things are coming together. And so the wines are never, they have nothing to do with like kind of what we imagine. And I think that we could almost throw anything sort of in there and it would be interesting. And so I definitely at this point feel like less of a need to be structured than I was in the beginning, but then I still feel I need something to catalyze my imagination. So like one of the things we're really excited about now is like kind of some of these like historic wines that we actually don't know what they were, like something like Malvasia, which we, use as a name for many, many, many different varieties, but at some point in time was actually a historical wine kind of with a name, but we don't know what that name really corresponded to. And for whatever reason, I just get really excited about just trying to like let my imagination like sort of be in that moment and then use that as a catalyst that hopefully something happens where we plant a parcel that is really beautiful to walk in and taste fruit from and experience in terms of like color and flavor of the berries, what the leaves look like, but then also that a wine emerges from that is sort of unexpectedly like kind of wonderful. But yeah, that's my best answer.
All right. Nate, I got to jump in here for a second, ask you, both of you this, because you mentioned irrationality, you mentioned creative obsession. And I mean, the businessman in me is like, okay, how the financial implications here, these styles, we have this paradigm in the wine world, of course, of dependability. And of course, even if not that, the stylistic variations between calling something Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Zinfandel, right? You're breaking down that conversation. So I think when you're making these creative decisions, investigations, okay, where is that commercial relevancy in your mind?
Well, there is certainly a tension between one's artistic aspirations and one's in the business reality. I mean, at a certain point, you've got to sell your product.
Right.
If you're growing grapes at 1 ton per acre, you need to get a pretty good bottle price for it. So minimally, your channel of distribution has to be a high yield channel, which means the direct to consumer. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to produce a product that people like drinking. I mean, if you can do this could be a wonderful product of your imagination, and that's great. But if wine is not drinkable or doesn't give people pleasure, it's sort of beside the point. So I guess the question is, how do you optimize the likelihood of producing a pleasurable wine without making the wine formulaic or trite or following a well-trodden path? How do you create something that's both new and unique and distinctive, but it's also fucking fantastic?
There is that tension there, exactly. The push and pull, the poetic, the creative, and then the pragmatic.
I mean, in my case, the thing that I count on is if I can produce a wine that expresses soil characteristics, I know I can produce a complex wine at Popolo Chuma. The only thing that I really cling to, or the thing that I cling to the most, is my belief in the uniqueness and distinctiveness and specialness of the place. I know and have observed that Popolo Chuma is a very special place to grow grapes. I mean, maybe not every square inch of it, but many square inches of it are. And so therefore, I mean, I feel I could grow Thompson seedless there and produce a respectable wine. Thompson.
Well, I'd like to continue this conversation, but take a quick break, and we will be right back. This episode is supported by Live. That's Live. Insider tip that stands for Low Input Viticulture and Enology. And guess what, folks? I have got Live's Executive Director, Chris Serra, right here to tell you all about Live's commitment to climate action, biodiversity, soil health, pesticide reduction, worker rights, and natural resource conservation. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Catherine. Good to be talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I can't wait to hear more. We are going to chat over the next 3 episodes about Live during our sponsor breaks, and I wanted to start with the biodiversity aspect of the Live certification. Tell me about the concept of integrated production. That's a kind of a new term for me, so tell me what that means.
Sure. Biodiversity plays a key role here. We're talking about encouraging the use of nature's regulating functions to reduce and sometimes eliminate the need for dangerous materials in farming and winemaking.
Aha. And so biodiversity, what are we talking about here? Maybe we're talking about buffer zones, that kind of thing?
Yeah, Live members must devote at least 5% of their land as ecologically diverse areas to compensate for their agricultural activities. Actually, many farms go far beyond this. The average Live member has over a quarter of their property set aside for this purpose.
Nice.
These areas can include wildflower meadows, hedgerows, and untouched forests. The biodiversity that they maintain restores a patchwork of natural connections and corridors at the landscape level to beat back the damaging displacement that modern monoculture causes, and also increases beneficial insect populations that can help control pests without the use of chemicals.
It's all about a polyculture, right? That is
Right.
the solution. Well, there are a couple of other certifications that we sometimes see on wine labels in the Pacific Northwest, and I believe these are kind of partner certifications that Live works with. Tell me about salmon safe and bee friendly farming.
Of course, our longtime partnership with Salmon Safe certification enables members to protect and restore the riparian areas around their farms and to protect fish. And in the same vein, we recently partnered with the Bee Friendly Farming certification program to focus on improving pollinator habitat and food sources in vineyards.
I love this so much. Thanks so much, Chris. I cannot wait to catch up with you during our next episode where we will learn about social sustainability. So see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think both of you have referenced what you're doing in terms of growing grapes in a really different way. You've talked about the genetic diversity that you're aiming for, and Randall, you're growing from seed. And Nate, I wanted to get into a little deeper into what you're doing in your vineyard because it's very interesting. It's going beyond field blends. I can't remember last time I spoke with you. I think you had 12 different field blends going. But you also had more than 100 grape varieties. And kind of tell us about how you're interplanting at your vineyard in Hiyu.
So Hiyu it's 30 acres, 14 acres in vine. It's 18 different field blends and about 112 different varieties. So we basically just took half acre to 1 acre parcels and planted them to these field blends, roughly based creatively on different moments in genetic history of the grapevine. And then we bottle all those separately as separate wines. And then we farm 5 other properties where we've been doing similar things in different locations in the gorge. So we farm it's like 38 acres in total. The field blend, it is like that part of it is really interesting, but it's part of this like bigger sort of vision of sort of farming system and sort of imagining like the vineyard as this culture of microbe, animal, and plant. And then, imagining that sort of building in the soil, coming up through the tissue, into the leaves, into the clusters, and then bringing that sort of into the winery. And then ultimately serving that, to people and trying to come up with a system that connects that whole thing, through this kind of sensual experience, through this sort of experience of beauty. And that's kind of what we're up to. And the field blends are so important because it's and Randall sort of spoken to this, is because the genetics that are embedded in those vines and that are learning kind of on the basis of all the things they're exposed to in terms of climate and the change of the seasons and sort of our actions as humans kind of amongst them. That genetics is then kind of relating to all the other genetic material that's in that space, like and particularly microbial and fungal. And so for us, like to do all the other things in terms of, how we're working with the soil, how we're working with spray programs and teas to kind of promote that activity, how we're working with the fermentations in the cellar, without kind of introducing the same diversity in the vineyard, we would have been missing a link.
But we're not just talking vineyard, right? I mean, last time I spoke with you, you were grafting multiple varieties onto the same vine. Are you still doing that? Or was it multiple clones?
Multiple varietals. I mean, we try to use as many clones as possible and as many varietals in whatever sort of situation. But because we're working, I mean, it's kind of like it's sort of a bad news bears situation. I mean, we're not, everything is quite rustic, which is sort of part of it, but it's also opportunistic. And so, we're working with existing vineyards as sort of a form of recycling, in a sense, and you have this rootstock that is already kind of producing all this life. And so we top work, we graft on top of these existing vines that in a lot of cases, are 15, 20, 25 years old. We try not to graft on the really old stuff. And when we do that, there's always, an opportunity for two bud sticks on either side of the plant with the kind of grafting technique that we're using. And so we just mix everything up together in a bag. And what the results in is sometimes one side of the plant is one grape and sometimes it's another. But the potential for taking that even further, I mean, with fruit trees, it's quite common, and especially the way fruit tree architecture works, to have, you can have trees with, 20 different kinds of apples on them. And that's not something that we're far enough along the line in terms of our sort of approach to creative grape pruning and stuff to pursue. But it's something that is certainly aspirational, just because all that stuff impacts flavor. Every single thing that you do, you can feel on the other side in the wine. And so again, another big thing for us is just never to take anything for granted, and leave no stone unturned in that sense.
Nate, you mentioned the word aspirational, and that's the first word that Randall used when he talked about his farming practice. This has been covered over the past few years about your the ultimate goal of introducing 10,000 new grape varieties. But if you haven't really addressed it the way you wanted to yet here, can you tell us about that goal?
Right. I mean, the thought is it's a strategy for expressing the terroir of the site, the unique characteristics of the site. The thought is by suppressing varietal characteristics, and I'd be suppressing varietal characteristics in virtue of the extreme diversity and the fact that each one is going to be very different from one another. It sort of allows for the greater, more articulate expression of soil characteristics. So it's really just a means to an end to more articulately express soil qualities in the wine. And the thought there is that any wine that has strong soil characteristics, in my experience, it produces an interesting wine. The varietal, the grape itself is really a carrier for the expression of the sort of more transcendental element that pervades the wine. In other words, I'm never going to get the exact perfect varietal mix. So why even try to take a different tack and basically decide that the varietal mix itself is less important, but what is more important is the expression of soil. I mean, I think there's always going to be an interest in efficiency, and polyculture is a wonderful way to grow things, but it's not necessarily the most efficient way of growing things. It's idiosyncratic. It's non-standardized. I mean, that's the whole point of it. But as a result, it makes it you have a limited audience for this kind of project.
Wait a minute, Randall. I think you're selling yourself short. You're saying it's not efficient, but I mean, imagine a future, not that we want to, where a lot more land is covered by ocean and land is hard to come by. I almost think what you both are describing is very efficient. The idea of, growing more than one crop in the same spot.
Yes and no. I mean, you can't get high production. In my experience is, maybe I'm just not a very good farmer, but the idea of producing a lot of crop does not work. I mean, if you're trying to do something really, really special, by definition, it's a limited production. I mean, there's a reason why conventional agriculture has dominated, because on the face of it, on many levels, it is, quote, more efficient. Everything ripens at the same time. You don't have to go back 10 times to pick your product. You don't have to backtrack so many times. You're one and done, if you will. You're producing a ton of fruit, or many tons of fruit. Not necessarily the most flavorful fruit, but lots of it. The market seems to find that very congenial. Standardization on some level works at the moment for a lot of people.
Okay, I think the tension here then, Randall, in case the tension here then becomes one of brutal efficiency on the one side, and the tension of a long-term resilience,
right,
on the other. Is that how you would?
Yeah, I think that's fair to characterize it that way. Yep.
What happens, when we don't take into account the needs of sort of every life form or being in the system, right? And this is the problem with brutal efficiency, is that because the viewpoint is so narrow, it's not seeing any of the other things that are kind of existing, sort of in a particular place. Like, we're talking about wines, when we talk about terroir, we're talking about sense of place. And so in any particular sort of spot on the earth, that efficiency is predominantly blind. And the effect of that blindness, right, is all the problems we're experiencing in the world in terms of, all the health crisis and, and global warming and, a million things, right? I think we all feel the crushing weight of just things spinning out of control in kind of the wrong direction. And so I think Randall's right to be pessimistic. I feel it. It doesn't, it certainly feels less than certain that we will go in this direction that sort of provides the solution. But the only way to move forward in a way that will prevent this sort of escalation of crises that we're experiencing is to be with the earth and be with the land in a way that pays attention everything that sort of to all beings that compose every place, and to kind of to learn to interact with that with care and empathy, and to learn just ways of listening to all those different things in the environment, right? And that is plants and animals and trees and microbes, but it's also bigger things, like the ocean or the atmosphere. And so, yeah, it takes all of this, is going to require this massive change in terms of how we orient ourselves to reality. Is that going to be easy? No, it's going to be incredibly hard. And I guess the one thing I would say is that science is an incredible tool, obviously, in understanding what's going on and articulating solutions. But we have other tools that are available to us to kind of address this. And some of those tools may be more intuitive and more efficient and more compelling than just science alone. And so for me, one of the big things is just talking about art and beauty and aesthetic, and how our sense of those things can help guide us on this path to kind of changing, the earth and kind of our relationship with it, and not to ignore that side of ourselves. And, and this is a big thing, in the food and wine industry, how we eat is this huge part of how we exist on the planet and how we relate to these resources. And it's a huge part to how we express ourselves culturally. And so we need to really pay attention, to that kind of cultural aspect of it if we want to do these things in a way that is better for all of us. Anyway, that was a super long one.
I love what you're saying, Nate. And I feel like this is a common thread, even though Randall and Nate, you're kind of doing different things. The common thread I'm hearing from both of you are words like beauty. And I think Randall said transcendental at one point. Both of you are looking to achieve something transcendent. And that's not often something that we hear when we're talking about the wine business. People talk about making wine and, there is some discussion of craftsmanship and a bit of artistry, but you're looking for something a little bit higher and almost more spiritual. And I love that sentiment because it is a way to kind of pull people along on this, admittedly, in a way, irrational adventure you're both on. Both of you I know have really strong followings, and I think it's because you're both so passionately tied up in this pursuit of beauty and a transcendent experience. So it's been really fun to hear you both talk about this.
It has been. And my goodness, I hate to wrap this up, but it's time for us to transition to our last little bit and our figurative dessert course, in which each of us shares a little something sweet that we've been, or enjoyable that we've been having a good time with this week. It doesn't have to be wine. It could be an idea, or it could be something food related. Nate, you're first for our figurative dessert course.
So for me, I'd like to recommend this book by a photographer based out of Buffalo. His name's Gregory Halpern, and the book is called Zizix.
How do you spell that?
It's like ZZYX or like something like that. It's hard to...
Zizix.
Yes. And it seems like a strange thing in the context of like agriculture, like our conversation to talk about in terms of like farming and biodiversity and like all those things. But what the book is sort of, it's a story told through images where, it's about Los Angeles. And he uses these images of people and buildings and plants and animals to tell this extraordinary story about place, about what it's like to sort of experience LA, in this really like beautiful way. And he does it in such a way in which you can really feel, for me, what I call vibrant matter, or like vital materialism, or these sort of like words from philosophy, but they all sort of describe the way in which for us to solve the problems that we're having kind of with the natural world, we need to start to see things kind of beyond humans as being like alive, right? Like, so there's a sense in which we're rocks that are living, right? We're all like, we're this conglomeration of minerals and microbes and fungi, like even in our bodies, right? So these things that we think of as not having life, right? With like their traditional view of like wines being about just soil, right?
Mm-hmm.
This book kind of really just, it makes it vivid and real for us, this way that we can see these other parts of the world as being as alive as we are. And so that's why I wanted to recommend it, because it for me makes this concept that just seems so out there and philosophical, like really practical and graspable. And it also just shows the way that kind of just that beauty can like lead us in ways of understanding.
That sounds amazing. I'm going to check that out. Thank you. And Randall, did you have a dessert course for us?
Well, first I have to say that I'm so honored and pleased to be sharing a conversation with an inveterate animist such as Nate.
It's kind of a dream team, you two.
Yeah, you both are.
It's really inspirational, I have to say. And I mean, that's sort of our job, is to inspire our clientele, our customers, and inspire ourselves, most importantly. In so doing, perhaps inspire others, and produce products that have life force. I mean, I think the whole idea is when you drink a bottle of wine, it should nourish you on every level, not just on a nutritional level, on a grossly physical level, but on a spiritual and emotional. And when you drink a great wine, it does nourish you. It enlivens you. It really does something special. And that's what we should aim for. Anything less is not acceptable.
That's a good quote. Thank you.
So my response to the dessert course is far more literal and not particularly figurative. And that is, I keep returning to the classic chartreuse In this case,
Yeah.
Tarragona, which I don't know how much life force it has, but I feel when I drink a great chartreuse. There's something magical. I mean, I think elixirs are magical or can be magical, and we should aim to drink magical elixirs whenever we possibly can. And for me, great chartreuse in very discrete quantity is exceptionally special. It never fails to inspire me.
And one of those historic curatives that every time I have a sip, I think I'm curing myself somehow. I'm not really sure how, but
I'm not sure what the problem is either, but
yeah, I'll still take the medicine.
Martin, how about you? Do you have a dessert for us?
Yeah, I keep going back to my day-to-day life as a parent of two, and I stumbled upon something recently. And if you are somebody that is short on time as a parent, or you have a child that's a picky eater, this new thing I discovered is Healthy Heights Grow Daily. It's designed for children, 3 and up, with good protein, good vitamins. My kids enjoyed them. They're not going to be something I give them every day. No, it's just when I'm short on time, when we all can stand and have a little bit of sanity in our lives.
And if you don't have a food forest in your backyard, because that sounds amazing. I wish I had one of those for my kids.
Yeah.
Well, so for my dessert, I wanted to honor Randall and his love of Rosese de Dolce Acqua. Randall, I don't know if you remember introducing me to Rosese, which I know is your favorite variety. And so one of my all-time favorite wines for many years, and of course everyone knows I'm a big rosé freak, is Clos-y-Beaune Tiburon, the Cuvée Tradition bottling, and has a wonderful old label. And for those of you who don't know the story, after phylloxera, most of the Provençal estates replanted with grapes that were easier to farm, even though the really traditional indigenous grape of Provence was Tiburon. And it was only saved from extinction by the Roux family at their beautiful Clos-y-Beaune, their Cru Classé vineyard, walled vineyard right in the beginning of the 20th century. And so Clos-y-Beaune is one of the very few French wineries that's allowed to name its cuvée after the grape it's made from, because they basically saved the grape, at least in Provence. And those of you who know this wine, I'm sure everyone on this episode does well with moderate oxidation. And so it's really fun to visit Clos-y-Beaune and see it's a rosé, but it rests in foudres, those giant oak casks, and they never fill them quite up. So there's oxygen, and then you can see this beautiful white yeast. They call it fleurette floating on top. So it's a really special wine, and I thought of it when I knew you were coming on the foretop, Randall. So I just wanted to talk about Tiburon, and I know you're making Tiburon in the United States now.
I've got actually about 2,000 Tiburon self-crossed variants, and I'm going to see a little fruit this year, and it'll give some insight as to maybe even the parentage of Tiburon, which is still unknown. Maybe I'll find some Tiburon Blanc, or who knows. By the way, I don't know if there's time, I have just to real quickly tell you, I visited Clos-y-Beaune, and I said to them, so what's the deal with the floor? They said, yeah, we got this darn floor. We didn't really know what to do with it, so we just decided. This was not this master stroke of enological genius. They just happened to have this stuff growing on their tanks, so they've made an accommodation.
I had heard that as well, and this is one of the many stories I can tell you, or we can all tell each other, about an American importer walking into a winery and saying, "Don't change a thing, because what you think of as just sort of what's randomly happening in my winery is so cool and interesting to especially New World wine enthusiasts, because we don't have those beautiful old cellars with all that wonderful yeast floating around." So,
yeah, I'm not going to make the obvious Shark Tank joke because Tiburon. Never mind. I'm not even going to address it.
I think it was André de Maison, who found the fleurette and said, "Don't change a thing" at Clos-y-Beaune. Anyway.
Excellent.
Well, on that note, thank you to our wonderful guests. And if you want to check out Randall Graham's Tiburon project, it's called Language of Yes. You can find it at languageofyeswine.com. If you want to read about Randall's vineyard, I am going to try to spell Poplochum, Popellouchum. So check it out.
Excellent. And you can check out Hiyu Wine Farms to learn about Nate Reddy's winemaking and farming at Hiyu, and that's spelled Hiyu, winefarm.com.
Excellent.
You can check out the new website for Napa Rise, and that's risegreen.org. You can also find me there at reyeswinegroup.com and at, as Randall would know, at winewise.biz.
That's right. And you can find me at catherinecole.com, but don't go there. Go to the Foretop, where you can also find our social media handles. Let us know what you thought of this episode. And of course, please support the Foretop by leaving us a rating on your favorite podcast app, especially Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Signing out today from the high fiber protein packed city of Berkeley. That's a new one for a moment. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
And signing out from the Willamette Valley. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.
This has been the Foretop Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer, Nick Toole is our producer, and I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor Michelle Richards, media and design manager Ruby Welkovich, and sales director Kristen Castagna. Please visit our website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. If you have not already subscribed to The Foretop on iTunes or Spotify, please do so, and please leave us a rating. Every rating feeds the algorithm and helps new listeners find The Foretop. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.